This channel is for women who are doing fine, but feel quietly lost. I wasn't looking for danger when I met him. That's the part people struggle to understand, and the part I need to say first, before anything else, because it dismantles a story we're all taught to tell ourselves. I didn't meet him in chaos. I didn't meet him while falling apart. I didn't meet him because I was desperate, lonely, or searching for someone to save me. I met him in the middle of a life that looked solid from the outside. It was daytime, a public place, a room full of competent adults who knew how to shake hands, exchange credentials, and speak in complete sentences. There were no warning signs that made my body tense, no instinctive recoil, no sense of threat. Everything about the moment felt familiar, safe, ordinary. That's the first lie about predators, that danger announces itself. We're taught that if we're smart enough, experienced enough, self-aware enough, we'll feel it coming, that our intuition will scream, that something in us will know immediately to step back. But real danger, the kind that rewires you quietly, doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives speaking your language. At that point in my life, I was doing fine. Not euphoric, not broken, just fine. I had a job that paid the bills. I was financially independent. I met my obligations. I answered emails. I returned calls. I showed up. If there was a fracture inside me, it didn't show. I carried it the way women my age are trained to carry everything, privately, competently, without asking for help. I wasn't searching for intensity. I wasn't bored with my life. I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was simply living. And that's what makes this story so unsettling, because nothing about the beginning felt dramatic. Nothing felt reckless. Nothing felt like a mistake. There was no moment I can point to and say, that's when I should have known. He didn't pursue me in a way that felt invasive. He didn't overwhelm me with attention or flattery. He didn't rush intimacy. He didn't push boundaries in ways I could easily name. What he did was listen. Not the performative kind of listening people use to appear engaged, not the distracted nodding we've all grown used to. He listened with focus, with memory, with a kind of attention that felt precise. It didn't feel like being watched. It felt like being seen. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. For women who have spent decades being the capable one, the reliable one, the emotionally literate one, being seen can feel rare. Not because no one notices us, but because we're so often noticed for what we provide, not for who we are. We become environments other people move through, systems that function smoothly, women who are fine. So when someone steps into that ordinary life and pays quiet, attuned attention, it doesn't feel dangerous. It feels like ease. It feels like conversation without friction, like being understood without having to explain yourself all the way to the bone. Like you don't have to manage the interaction to keep it comfortable. I didn't feel chased. I didn't feel cornered. I didn't feel special in a grand, intoxicating way. I felt calm, and that calm is what confuses people later. Because when the story falls apart, everyone wants to locate the moment of foolishness, the lapse in judgment, the point where intelligence failed. They ask questions like, why didn't you see it? Why didn't you trust your gut? Why didn't you leave sooner? Those questions assume the danger was visible. It wasn't. This isn't a story about red flags I ignored. It's a story about how the trap works when there are no flags to wave, when nothing feels extreme. when everything stays within the bounds of what looks reasonable, respectful, adult. I didn't feel afraid. I felt steady. I wasn't looking to be rescued. I wasn't trying to escape my life. I wasn't seeking validation. And yet, something in me shifted, quietly, so quietly that I didn't notice it happening. Not at first. That's another uncomfortable truth. Predators don't need you to be weak. They don't need you to be lost. They don't need you to be looking for anything at all. They only need you to be human. They need you to have a nervous system that responds to attunement, a conscience that hesitates before harm, a tendency to assume good intent, a habit of looking inward before accusing outward. They need you to be functional enough that no one worries about you, strong enough that you don't collapse, empathetic enough that you keep trying to understand instead of walking away. I wasn't broken when I met him. I was standing. And that's often when the door opens. If this opening already feels uncomfortably familiar, if something in your chest tightened, or your breath shifted, or a memory stirred that you don't fully want to look at yet, I want to say this clearly before we go any further. This story is not about stupidity. It is not about naivete. It is not about poor choices. It is about how certain dynamics enter quietly through the front door and rearrange you from the inside without ever asking permission. If this kind of deep, psychological storytelling matters to you, if you're not looking for advice, but for truth that actually names what happened, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is what allows this space to exist and what gives us the freedom to keep telling the stories most people rush past or oversimplify. Because what comes next isn't about him. It's about why women like us, smart, capable, grounded women, walk into these stories without ever realizing we've crossed a threshold. And once you see how that threshold works, you can never unsee it. What took me the longest to understand was not who he was, but why I had been visible to him at all. For a long time, I believed I had been chosen because something in me was lacking, that there must have been a weakness I couldn't see at the time, some insecurity, some hidden need, some quiet desperation that made me an easy target. That explanation felt almost comforting because it placed the danger inside me. If the problem was my weakness, then at least it was familiar. At least it was something I could try to fix. But that story collapsed the moment I looked at myself honestly. I wasn't unraveling when he entered my life. I wasn't floundering or flailing or asking to be saved. I was functioning, working, responsible. The kind of woman people rely on without thinking twice. The kind who keeps things moving, keeps things steady, keeps things from falling apart. And that is exactly what he saw. Predators do not look for people who collapse under pressure. Collapse is inconvenient. Collapse draws attention. Collapse requires care. They have no interest in giving. What they look for instead is capacity, the ability to absorb strain without breaking, to carry emotional weight without complaint, to remain upright even when something inside has shifted. I had that capacity in abundance. I had spent most of my adult life being the stable one, the reasonable one, the woman who could be counted on to respond thoughtfully instead of react impulsively. I believed deeply in repair, in communication, in working through things rather than walking away at the first sign of discomfort. Those beliefs had shaped my career, my friendships, my sense of self. They were not flaws. But in the presence of someone who understood how to exploit them, they became openings. He didn't mistake my strength for invulnerability. He understood it as endurance. He saw that I could tolerate ambiguity longer than most people, that I would sit with discomfort and try to make sense of it rather than flee, that my instinct was to ask, "What am I missing?" before asking, "What are you doing?" That instinct had been praised my entire life. In workplaces, it made me competent. In relationships, it made me patient. In conflict, it made me fair. With him, it made me predictable. Another myth I had to unlearn was the idea that predators seek out low self esteem, that they hunt people who don't know their worth. It's an easy story to tell because it creates distance. It lets people believe this could never happen to them. But many of us begin these relationships with solid self respect. What changes is not our value, but our orientation. Over time, attention shifts from honoring ourselves to preserving stability, from listening inward to maintaining equilibrium, from asking what we need to asking what will keep things calm. That shift does not happen all at once. It is learned. When he entered my life, I was in a moment of transition, not a collapse, not a crisis, just a quiet rearranging. A chapter had ended. Something familiar had dissolved. I was still standing, still capable, still moving forward, but there was a subtle openness where certainty used to be. That openness was not weakness. It was availability. Predators are exquisitely attuned to moments like that. They do not rush in aggressively. They do not overwhelm. They approach carefully, often with restraint. They offer understanding before asking for anything. They let you believe the connection is mutual, organic, even accidental. And because I was still strong, still functioning, I didn't see myself as vulnerable. I saw myself as resilient. Resilience is one of the most misunderstood traits in women like us. We're taught to admire it, to cultivate it, to wear it as evidence of maturity. We're rarely taught that resilience, without boundaries, can be exploited. That the ability to endure can become a liability in environments that require self-protection rather than perseverance. He saw my resilience not as something to respect, but as something to use. He noticed how I handled responsibility, how seriously I took my commitments, how uncomfortable I was with the idea of giving up on people, how quickly I took ownership when something went wrong, even when it wasn't entirely mine to carry. These were not guesses. They were observations. Predators are patient observers. They collect information long before they make moves. They watch how you respond to small disruptions, how you handle being misunderstood, how much you're willing to explain yourself to restore harmony. Every response teaches them something. Someone who leaves quickly is not an ideal target. Someone who explodes unpredictably is difficult to control. But someone who engages, who stays in the conversation, who believes in resolution, who assumes good intent, is gold. I didn't stay because I lacked strength. I stayed because strength was part of my identity. Leaving goes against the wiring of women who have built their lives around responsibility. We are not raised to abandon relationships at the first sign of distress. We are taught to troubleshoot, to repair, to persevere, to be fair. Those values create healthy bonds with healthy people. With someone like him, they become tools. Over time, my strength began to turn inward. My conscientiousness became self-surveillance. My empathy became self-blame. My resilience became self-sacrifice. I began managing myself more than the relationship, adjusting, accommodating, anticipating, believing that if I calibrated correctly, stability would return. This is how strength is eroded without force. And from the outside, I still looked capable. I still functioned. I still showed up. The unraveling happened quietly, in places no one else could see. That's why the narrative that predators hunt weakness is so damaging. It misidentifies the beginning. It looks at the end state, the exhaustion, the confusion, the diminished sense of self, and assumes that's who the woman was all along. It wasn't. That was the result of prolonged exposure. What he saw before I ever did was not my fragility. It was my capacity to hold things together long after they should have been set down. He recognized the traits that had served me well everywhere else and understood how to turn them against me slowly without triggering resistance. Understanding this did not make me feel proud. It made me feel clear. It explained why I stayed without condemning me for it. It allowed me to reclaim my identity without shame. I did not need to become harder or less caring to protect myself. I needed to understand where my strengths belonged and where they did not. Because strength is not the ability to endure harm indefinitely. Strength is knowing when endurance is no longer wisdom. And once I saw that, the question stopped being, what's wrong with me? It became something far more honest and far more useful. What was taken advantage of? What made him so convincing wasn't his confidence or his intelligence. It was his fluency. He spoke the language of emotions the way some people speak a second language, smoothly, without hesitation, with all the right inflections. He didn't stumble when feelings came up. He didn't deflect or minimize. He didn't scoff at introspection or dismiss vulnerability as weakness. On the contrary, he seemed comfortable inside those conversations, as if they were familiar terrain. That mattered to me more than I realized at the time. I had spent enough years navigating emotionally clumsy spaces. Workplaces where feelings were liabilities, relationships where depth had to be negotiated inch by inch, that someone who could name internal states without flinching felt rare, safe even. He talked about values easily, about honesty, about growth, about accountability. He could articulate why things mattered, not just that they did. I assumed that fluency meant alignment, that if someone could speak about empathy, they must be guided by it. That if someone could describe harm clearly, they would feel compelled to avoid causing it. That assumption turned out to be the most dangerous one I made. Because emotional fluency is not the same thing as emotional conscience. What I eventually understood, long after the confusion set in, was that he didn't lack insight. He lacked restraint. He could recognize pain without being regulated by it. He could understand that something hurt me without experiencing the internal pressure to stop. My reactions didn't trigger discomfort in him. They registered as information. That difference is subtle, but it changes everything. When I caused harm, intentionally or not, I felt it in my body, a tightening, a pause, a need to repair. That sensation shaped my behavior even when no one was watching. It slowed me down. It made me careful. It forced me to consider consequences beyond my own comfort. He did not experience that pause. He knew what pain looked like. He could describe it accurately. But it did not create friction inside him. There was no enduring internal resistance that altered his course. He could apologize convincingly without feeling changed. He could acknowledge impact without carrying it. At first, I misread this as emotional maturity, as steadiness, as someone who didn't get overwhelmed by feelings. In reality, it was an absence. This is where many people get lost when trying to understand men like him. They look for cruelty as the defining feature, for volatility, for obvious aggression. When they don't find it, they assume safety. But the most destabilizing dynamics don't come from people who are out of control. They come from people who are unencumbered. He could say anything without the internal cost that would stop me. Promise anything without the weight of follow through pressing on his conscience. Deny anything without the discomfort that would unravel most people from the inside out. That asymmetry created an uneven playing field long before I recognized it as such. I assumed we were governed by the same internal rules, that if something mattered deeply to me, it would matter to him in a similar way. That shared language meant shared limits. It didn't. When things began to feel off, when words and actions drifted apart, I didn't immediately suspect manipulation. I suspected misunderstanding. I believed there must be a way to clarify, to communicate better, to close the gap. After all, he understood the language. He spoke it fluently. Surely this was a matter of translation. That belief kept me engaged far longer than I otherwise would have been. He could talk about values without being bound by them. He could perform empathy without having access to its regulating function. He could describe accountability without practicing it consistently. And because most of us assume others operate with the same internal brakes we do, I kept searching for the version of him that matched the words. I thought, if I explain it clearly enough, he'll see. I thought, if he understands how this affects me, he'll adjust. I thought, no one who can articulate this much insight would choose to keep hurting someone. But choice looks different when conscience is absent. For him, my pain was not a signal to change. It was a variable to manage. Sometimes that management looked like tenderness. Sometimes it looked like distance. Sometimes it looked like defensiveness or reframing. What it never looked like was sustained alteration of behavior. And because he could talk so convincingly about growth, each inconsistency felt temporary, contextual, fixable. I kept believing I was witnessing a work in progress rather than a structural limitation. This is where emotional fluency becomes camouflage. From the outside, he appeared thoughtful, reasonable, even moral. He could discuss loyalty, fairness, and love with an ease that reassured others. People assumed good faith because the language was correct, the tone was right, the self-awareness appeared intact. What they couldn't see, and what I struggled to see from the inside, was that insight without conscience does not lead to restraint. It leads to strategy. He knew how he was perceived. He knew which version of himself would land in which context. When warmth worked, he used warmth. When distance worked, he withdrew. When accountability was required to keep me engaged, he offered just enough of it to stabilize the situation. What looked like inconsistency was actually adaptability. And adaptability, without moral friction, is dangerous. This is why his behavior confused me so deeply. I could list moments of genuine seeming care, times when he showed up, listened, appeared supportive. Those moments felt real because they were real actions. What wasn't real was the meaning I attached to them. For him, good behavior wasn't an expression of character. It was a tool, a way to regulate the dynamic, to restore equilibrium, to maintain access. Kindness appeared when it served a purpose. It disappeared when it didn't. This selective kindness is what keeps people trapped, because when harm is constant, it's easy to name. When harm alternates with care, it becomes ambiguous. You begin to weigh moments against each other. You start building cases in your mind, ranking behaviors, searching for proof that the good outweighs the bad. But harm doesn't need to be constant to be real. The absence beneath his fluency eventually became impossible to ignore. Not because he suddenly changed, but because the pattern didn't. No matter how clearly things were discussed, no matter how much insight was demonstrated, the outcome remained the same. My needs were acknowledged but not honored. My boundaries were understood but not respected. My pain was named but not prevented from recurring. And that was the moment something shifted. I stopped asking whether he understood. He always had. The question that finally mattered was whether understanding was enough to change anything. It wasn't. And realizing that forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding. I was not dealing with someone who needed more clarity or more time. I was dealing with someone whose internal architecture did not include the mechanisms I relied on to stay safe. That realization didn't arrive as anger, it arrived as clarity. Because once you see the difference between emotional fluency and emotional conscience, you stop negotiating with language. You stop waiting for words to turn into limits. You stop mistaking articulation for integrity. You begin to understand that the danger was never in what he couldn't say. It was in what he could say without being changed by any of it. The early stage didn't feel dramatic. That's what made it so effective. There was no rush, no grand declaration, no moment where I felt swept off my feet. What I felt instead was something quieter, almost physiological. A sense of ease I hadn't realized was missing. Conversations that didn't require effort. Silence that didn't feel awkward. Attention that stayed with me instead of drifting away halfway through a sentence. It didn't feel like intensity. It felt like relief. In a world where everyone is busy performing competence, attention has become a scarce resource. We're interrupted constantly by phones, by schedules, by our own internal checklists. We learn to compress ourselves into manageable versions. Say the important parts quickly, skip what feels too much, keep things moving. So when someone slows down with you, really slows down, it can feel like stepping into oxygen after living at altitude. He didn't flood me with messages or compliments. He didn't try to dominate my time. He simply stayed present. When I spoke, he didn't scan the room or glance at his phone. He didn't rush to respond with his own story. He held the space just long enough for my thoughts to finish forming. That kind of attention does something subtle to the nervous system. You don't think, this is dangerous. You think, this is rare. And because it feels rare, it feels valuable. I didn't feel pursued. I felt chosen, but not in a flattering way, in a confirming way, as if something unspoken in me had been noticed and respected. That confirmation bypassed my skepticism. It didn't trigger alarm because it didn't demand anything in return. That's how the trap opens without force. Predators don't begin by taking. They begin by offering. They create an emotional environment where openness feels voluntary, even natural. Where vulnerability doesn't feel extracted, but invited. They don't push you into intimacy. They arrange the conditions so intimacy feels like your idea. And because I value agency, that mattered. He paced himself to match me. When I was reserved, he was patient. When I shared more, he didn't pull back or escalate. He mirrored my rhythm so precisely that it felt mutual, balanced, earned. There was no sense of being overtaken, no urgency, no pressure to define anything, just presence. What I didn't recognize at the time was how regulating that presence felt, how my body responded before my mind had words for it, how tension I'd been carrying without noticing began to soften in his company. This wasn't about romance at first. It was about attunement. Attunement is powerful, especially for women who have spent years being attuned to everyone else. For women who manage households, teams, relationships, and emotional climates without calling it labor. We become experts at reading rooms, anticipating needs, smoothing edges. Rarely are we on the receiving end of that same precision. So, when someone reflects your inner pace instead of disrupting it, it feels grounding, stabilizing, safe. That safety is what confuses people later, because it doesn't feel manipulative, it feels respectful. He didn't overwhelm me with information or intensity. He revealed himself slowly, selectively, just enough to feel human, just enough to invite empathy without demanding accountability. Stories of being misunderstood, of carrying burdens quietly, of having depth that others didn't always see. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that raised suspicion. Just enough to soften my internal boundaries. And because I am wired to respond to complexity with compassion, that softness mattered. It made me patient. It made me generous with interpretation. It made me more willing to assume context rather than intent. Predators understand this instinctively. They know that empathy lowers defenses more effectively than force ever could. That when you feel understood, you stop protecting yourself. You assume alignment, you relax into the connection. That relaxation is not stupidity. It is a biological response to perceived safety. As access increased, so did proximity. More time, longer conversations, a sense of continuity that grew without formal agreement. He didn't demand centrality in my life. He simply became present enough that his absence would be noticed. That's an important distinction. He didn't announce himself as essential. He allowed himself to become familiar. And familiarity is one of the most powerful attachment mechanisms we have. I didn't notice the shift because nothing changed abruptly. There was no line crossed, just a gradual reorientation. I began to think of him during the day, to anticipate our conversations, to feel a subtle letdown when they didn't happen. Not longing, not obsession, expectation. That's how attention becomes oxygen. You don't crave it because it's intoxicating. You crave it because your system has adjusted to its presence. What once felt neutral now feels thin without it. And when attention is tied to emotional relief, when it calms your nervous system without asking you to do anything in return, it becomes associated with safety. This is where logic loses its footing, because the mind may not be convinced yet, but the body has already learned something. It has learned that proximity equals ease, that this presence regulates something inside you that has been quietly overworking for years. And once that association forms, the stakes change. I didn't know I was stepping into a trap because nothing about it felt like confinement. It felt like expansion, like space to breathe, like being met instead of managed. That's what makes this phase so dangerous and so rarely named. We talk about manipulation as pressure, as control, as overt domination. But the most effective traps don't restrict you at first. They soothe you, they make you feel more yourself, not less. By the time anything feels off, you're already oriented toward the source of that relief. Already invested in maintaining the environment that made you feel calmer, clearer, more at ease. And leaving no longer feels like a simple decision. It feels like giving something up your body has already claimed as necessary. That's how the trap begins. Not with force, not with fear, but with attention that feels like oxygen and a system that quietly learns to depend on it. When he said it, the words didn't land with drama. There was no pause designed for impact, no smile waiting for my reaction. It came almost casually, folded into a conversation that already felt intimate in a quiet way. I've never met anyone like you. What I felt in that moment wasn't flattery. It was recognition. That difference matters because flattery excites the ego, but recognition reaches something deeper. It touches the part of you that has spent years translating yourself for others, the part that has learned to simplify, soften, or compress your inner world so it fits into ordinary conversations. When someone seems to recognize you without requiring that translation, it feels extraordinary. It feels earned. I didn't hear his words as praise. I heard them as confirmation, as if something essential about me, something I rarely named out loud, had been noticed and understood. It didn't make me feel elevated above others. It made me feel seen within myself. That's the power of what psychologists sometimes call twinning, though the word itself feels too clinical to capture the experience. This wasn't imitation in the obvious sense. He didn't copy my opinions or mirror my gestures in ways that felt artificial. He didn't agree with me reflexively or parrot my language back at me. What he did was subtler. He aligned. He spoke to the values beneath my words, not just the words themselves. When I talked about honesty, he responded with stories that carried the same moral weight. When I described feeling different growing up, he shared experiences that landed in the same emotional register. When I spoke about responsibility, not as a burden, but as a way of orienting myself in the world, he reflected that gravity without exaggeration. Nothing felt forced. Nothing felt rehearsed. That's why it worked. Twinning doesn't invent a connection. It reflects the one already present. By the time it happens, the predator already knows who you are. He has listened carefully. He has noticed patterns. He has cataloged what matters to you, what moves you, what wounds you, what you protect. Twinning is simply the performance of understanding, and understanding feels intimate. For someone like me, someone who has spent much of her life understanding others more than being understood, that intimacy felt like relief. I didn't think, he's just like me, I thought. He understands me in a way most people don't. That belief bypasses caution. It creates a powerful internal story. This connection is different, deeper, rarer, less bound by the ordinary rules that apply elsewhere. And once that story takes hold, discernment shifts quietly into the background. I stopped scanning for differences. I stopped noticing friction. I assumed alignment where none had been tested. That's the danger of twinning. It accelerates emotional closeness without earning trust. It creates depth without foundation. The bond feels immediate because it's built from your own internal material. He didn't have to reveal much of himself. He reflected me back to myself with precision. The result is a sense of sameness that feels almost sacred. And because it feels sacred, it feels protected. You don't interrogate it. You don't want to risk disturbing it with skepticism. You don't slow down to ask whether this alignment has been proven over time. You assume it has. I didn't notice how quickly I began to excuse things that didn't quite fit. Small inconsistencies, moments of distance, subtle shifts in tone. They didn't register as warning signs because they didn't match the story I believed about who he was. He wouldn't mean that. He's not like other people. I know who he is. That knowing felt solid, certain, but it was built on reflection, not reciprocity. Another reason twinning is so effective is that it flatters without praise. Instead of telling you how special you are, it implies that your uniqueness is self evident. That recognition, rather than validation, is the gift. It doesn't inflate you, it resonates with you. Predators understand that overt flattery can raise suspicion. Recognition lowers defenses. And once twinning is established, it becomes the reference point for everything that follows. When confusion appears later, when words stop matching actions, when warmth turns cold, you don't question the foundation. You question yourself. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I'm overreacting. We're so alike. This must be a miscommunication. Twinning creates a false sense of shared identity that makes separation feel like self betrayal. If this person understands me at this level, then distancing from him feels like distancing from myself. That's not accidental. I found myself checking his reactions more than my own instincts, wanting to stay aligned, wanting to preserve the sense of being understood. I didn't notice the cost at first because the cost was internal, subtle, quiet. Deviation began to feel risky. If I challenged him, I risked disrupting the harmony. If I asserted a boundary, I risked becoming different. If I expressed doubt, I risked losing the connection that felt so rare. He didn't have to say any of this out loud. A slight withdrawal of warmth communicated it clearly. A raised eyebrow, a subtle disappointment. These small signals were enough to pull me back into sync. This is where twinning becomes a trap, because once alignment is established, control doesn't require force. It requires contrast. Warmth versus distance, understanding versus confusion, belonging versus separation. And for someone who values harmony, that contrast is deeply uncomfortable. One of the most devastating moments for survivors often comes later, when they realize that what felt unique was not exclusive. The same words, the same gestures, the same sense of being seen appears elsewhere, with someone else. It feels like erasure. Was any of it real? The answer is complicated. The connection felt real because my feelings were real. The recognition felt real because it was based on me. What wasn't real was the reciprocity. He wasn't bonding through sameness. He was attaching through utility. That doesn't mean every moment was fake. It means the meaning I assigned to those moments was not shared. Understanding this doesn't require becoming suspicious of connection. It requires learning to notice when sameness arrives fully formed, without friction, without difference, without the slow unfolding that characterizes real intimacy. Healthy relationships include overlap and divergence, agreement and disagreement, curiosity and boundaries. They develop over time through exposure to disappointment and repair. Twinning appears complete from the beginning, and what arrives complete rarely is. When I look back now, the phrase, I've never met anyone like you no longer sounds romantic. It sounds like an opening, a way in, a sentence that bypassed my defenses by speaking directly to the part of me that wanted to be known without effort. I don't blame myself for responding to that. It didn't make me foolish. It made me human. But understanding how that illusion was created gave me something invaluable later on. The ability to recognize when being seen is actually being reflected, and when recognition is being used as a bridge into my inner world without the responsibility of meeting me there. Because real understanding doesn't require perfect alignment, it allows for difference. And difference, I eventually learned, is where safety lives. By the time I realized something was wrong, my body already knew something my mind was still negotiating. That realization came much later. At the time, all I felt was confusion, an unease I couldn't quite place, a subtle dissonance between what I thought and what I felt. I kept trying to resolve it through logic, through conversation, through interpretation. I believed that if I could just understand what was happening, my reactions would settle. They didn't, because what was happening wasn't happening in my thoughts. It was happening beneath them. Trauma bonding doesn't begin with pain. That's one of the most misunderstood parts of this experience. People imagine that suffering creates attachment, that harm itself is what traps you. But harm alone rarely holds anyone for long. What binds is relief. In the early phase, his presence regulated me, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that felt intoxicating or overwhelming. It was quieter than that. My shoulders dropped when I was with him. My breathing slowed. The low grade tension I had learned to live with, so constant I no longer noticed it, softened. I didn't register this as dependency. I registered it as comfort. My body learned that something felt better in his presence, that the background noise quieted, that I didn't have to stay as vigilant, that I could rest just slightly without consequences. Those associations formed quickly because the nervous system is designed to learn from patterns, not explanations. When I was stressed, he appeared. When I felt uncertain, he listened. When I felt exposed, he leaned in. Each time, my body paired vulnerability with relief. That pairing is powerful. It happens below language, below choice, below the part of the brain that weighs pros and cons. And once it forms, it doesn't dissolve just because you recognize it intellectually. Later, when moments of confusion or discomfort began to surface, my body didn't register those as danger in the way I expected. Instead, it searched for the familiar pattern, the relief that usually followed, the warmth that had been associated with safety. This is how the loop begins. Pain followed by relief doesn't weaken attachment, it strengthens it. The inconsistency itself becomes the hook. If the harm were constant, the nervous system would mobilize toward escape. But when harm alternates with care, the system stays engaged, scanning for the return of regulation. I didn't stay because I didn't see the harm. I stayed because my body had learned that endurance led to relief. There were moments, often late at night, when conversations stretched beyond time, when fatigue blurred my edges and emotional disclosure felt effortless, when my mind felt focused and foggy at the same time. Those moments felt meaningful, even sacred. They were trance states, not hypnosis in the theatrical sense, but a narrowing of attention that reduces critical distance. The brain does this naturally under conditions of exhaustion, emotional intensity, or prolonged focus. It's the same mechanism that allows us to lose ourselves in music or stories. Predators know how to induce these states without naming them. Low lighting, long eye contact, quiet voices, emotional intimacy when defenses are already down. In those moments, my capacity to evaluate was compromised, not because I was weak, but because my nervous system prioritized connection over assessment. The brain chooses regulation before truth when it feels overwhelmed. That's not a failure of intelligence. It's a survival response. This is why so many survivors say, I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't leave. It isn't because they lack insight. It's because their bodies interpret separation as danger. The imagined loss of the person becomes entangled with the imagined loss of safety itself. When things began to feel off, when words stopped matching actions, when warmth alternated with distance, I didn't experience a clean emotional signal that said, this is unsafe. I experienced anxiety, tightness, a vague sense of urgency, and my body reached instinctively for the thing it had learned would make that feeling stop: him. This is where shame often enters the picture. From the outside, it can look like dependency or addiction. From the inside, it feels like survival. You're not trying to preserve the relationship. You're trying to regulate your body. Friends would point out inconsistencies, red flags, patterns. I could hear them. I could even agree with them in moments of clarity. But the moment separation became real, when I imagined not seeing him, not hearing his voice, not having access to that regulating presence, my body reacted with panic. My chest tightened, my thoughts scattered. A sense of threat flooded in. That reaction wasn't intuition, it was conditioning. Predators exploit attachment systems that evolved to keep humans bonded to caregivers and communities. They insert themselves into those systems by pairing distress with relief. Over time, the body collapses the two experiences into a single loop. The person becomes both the wound and the bandage. This is why facts don't break trauma bonds. Information doesn't reach the part of the brain that's driving behavior. The nervous system doesn't respond to evidence the way it responds to perceived safety. And this is also why survivors often feel detached, foggy, or unreal during this phase. Dissociation is the brain's way of protecting itself from overload. It creates distance from unbearable conflict between what you know and what your body demands. I remember moments when I felt like I was watching myself from the outside, making choices I couldn't fully explain, agreeing to things that didn't align with my values, telling myself I would address it later when I felt clearer. That clarity never came while I was still inside the loop. Predators understand this intuitively. They escalate closeness when you're tired. They initiate heavy conversations late at night. They reappear during moments of vulnerability. Not because they want to soothe you, but because they want to embed themselves deeper into your stress response. Over time, separation begins to feel more dangerous than staying. Not because staying is safe, but because it's familiar. The body chooses the known threat over the unknown void. This is why leaving feels like withdrawal, not metaphorically, but biologically. The system has adapted to cycles of distress and relief. When the cycle stops, the body panics, and that panic convinces you something is wrong with you. It isn't. The bond is not who you are. It is something that happened to you. Understanding this was one of the most important shifts in my recovery. It allowed me to stop judging myself for reactions I didn't choose. It helped me see that my body had been doing exactly what it was designed to do: keep me connected to what it believed was safety. The tragedy is not that the body learned this. The tragedy is that it learned it in the presence of someone who could not be safe. Trauma bonds are powerful, but they are not permanent. They weaken when the pattern is interrupted, when distance creates new associations, when the nervous system has time to relearn what calm feels like without cost. But that relearning cannot happen while the source of the conditioning remains present. My body learned before my mind did, and it took distance, not insight, to teach it something new. I knew long before I left. That is the part people don't expect, and the part that carries the most quiet shame. They imagine ignorance, blindness, denial, some dramatic refusal to see what was obvious. They imagine a woman clinging to fantasy because she doesn't want the truth. But I knew. I noticed the inconsistencies. The way words softened while actions hardened. The way apologies arrived without changing the outcome. The way clarity came in flashes, only to dissolve again into confusion. I could name what was happening in moments of distance. I could articulate it late at night, alone, with unnerving precision. And still, I stayed. Not because I didn't understand, because understanding wasn't the part of me making the decisions. For a long time, I believed knowledge should be enough, that once something is seen clearly, action naturally follows. That's the story we tell ourselves because it makes the world feel orderly. Cause and effect, truth and consequence. But human attachment doesn't work that way. By the time my mind could name the pattern, my nervous system was already invested in maintaining the bond. Leaving wasn't just a decision, it was a perceived threat. And when threat is perceived, whether physical or emotional, the brain reorganizes priorities. Survival overrides logic. Attachment takes precedence over accuracy. This is the piece almost no one talks about. Facts didn't fail because they were wrong. They failed because they arrived while my body still believed connection equaled safety. When friends pointed out red flags, my body reacted before my mind could respond. Tightness in my chest, a spike of anxiety, an urge to explain, soften, contextualize. Not because the facts were inaccurate, but because they threatened the attachment my nervous system depended on to stay regulated. The body heard something different than the words being spoken. It heard, if you accept this, you will be alone. If you accept this, you will not be okay. So my mind did what it had to do to reduce that threat. It minimized, it rationalized, it reframed. This wasn't denial in the way people imagine denial. It wasn't stubbornness or fantasy. It was self-preservation. I wasn't trying to protect him. I was trying to protect my body from panic. This is why facts alone often backfire. When someone is trauma bonded, information can feel like an attack, not on the relationship, but on the nervous system's last known source of relief. Pressure to leave, urgency to act, certainty imposed from the outside, all register as danger. And danger drives people closer to what feels familiar. I noticed this in myself with painful clarity. When I felt cornered, when someone pushed me to just leave, I didn't feel empowered. I felt exposed, rushed, as if something essential was being demanded before I was ready to give it. That pressure made me retreat inward, not outward, toward him, not away. Predators rely on this dynamic, whether consciously or instinctively. They benefit from urgency, from confusion, from the survivor feeling flooded with information, but starved for safety. They often frame outside concern as interference, misunderstanding, or control. They don't understand us. They're trying to turn you against me. They don't see what we have. These narratives work because they align with the survivor's internal conflict. Part of me already felt torn, already felt unsafe choosing separation. The external pressure intensified that fear rather than resolving it. Another reason knowing didn't set me free was moral conditioning. I had been taught, implicitly, consistently, that leaving is something you do only after you've exhausted every option. That commitment means staying when things are hard. That empathy is measured by endurance. That walking away without absolute certainty is a failure of character. Those beliefs are powerful, especially in women who take responsibility seriously. So, when facts emerged, they didn't arrive in a neutral space. They collided with values. I wasn't just deciding whether something was harmful. I was deciding what kind of person I was if I acknowledged it. What kind of person leaves someone who is struggling? What kind of person gives up without a final explanation? What kind of person chooses themselves when someone else claims to need them? Facts don't answer moral questions. They intensify them. I wasn't asking, is this bad? I was asking, am I allowed to leave if it is? That question kept me suspended between knowing and acting. There was also the problem of coherence. I wasn't ready to make a decision yet. I was still trying to make sense of the story, to reconcile the good moments with the harm, to find an explanation that would allow both to exist without invalidating each other. I wanted meaning before I wanted freedom. Facts that pointed toward danger didn't offer meaning. They shattered it. And shattering a worldview without offering a stable alternative creates panic. The mind reaches for anything that restores coherence, even if it costs truth. So I waited. I waited for the missing piece, the explanation that would make everything click, the insight that would transform understanding into resolution. It didn't come. What came instead was repetition. The same argument in a different form, the same apology with slightly altered language, the same sense of hope followed by the same outcome. Over time, the facts stopped feeling like information and started feeling like grief. That shift mattered. Grief is not analytical. It doesn't debate. It doesn't negotiate. It accepts. And acceptance, real acceptance, requires capacity. It requires the nervous system to be calm enough to tolerate the loss of the story you were living inside. For me, that capacity didn't arrive through confrontation or clarity. It arrived through accumulation, through the slow, undeniable weight of pattern. I didn't leave because I learned something new. I left because the truth finally landed in a body that was ready to feel it without collapsing. That's the part most people miss. Survivors don't leave when they know. They leave when their nervous system can support the knowing. When fear loosens its grip enough to make space for action. Understanding this changed the way I saw myself. It stripped away the judgment I had internalized. It allowed me to see that my delay wasn't weakness or indecision, it was timing. Knowing didn't set me free. Capacity did. And capacity is built through safety, not pressure, through validation, not urgency, through time, not arguments. Once I understood that, I stopped asking why facts hadn't saved me. I started asking a better question. What did I need before truth could matter? The answer wasn't more information. It was safety. enough of it to choose myself without my body believing I was in danger for doing so. What finally unsettled me wasn't a single betrayal, a single argument, or a single moment of cruelty. If it had been, I might have left sooner. Clean breaks are easier when the harm is concentrated. What kept me suspended was not intensity, it was repetition. The same emotional arc again and again. At first, each cycle felt like movement, like we were navigating difficulty, like friction was a sign of depth. I told myself that meaningful relationships weren't smooth, that growth required discomfort, that understanding came from working through things rather than walking away. Those beliefs felt mature, responsible, earned, but slowly, something began to feel wrong. Not dramatic, just off. I noticed that while the details changed, the outcome never did. The conversation sounded different, but they ended in the same place. The promises evolved, but the behavior returned to its familiar shape. Hope would rise, tension would creep in, something would fracture. And then, just when I felt most depleted, there would be a softening, an apology, a moment of tenderness, a return to something that resembled connection. Each time, my body relaxed. Relief washed through me. The anxiety quieted. The story made sense again. That relief wasn't accidental. This was the cycle. Though I didn't have language for it at the time. And because I didn't have language, I interpreted it as progress. I thought we were learning, adjusting, getting closer to a resolution. I wasn't yet able to see that the cycle wasn't failing. It was working. The first phase always felt like arrival. Not dramatic arrival, nothing that would raise suspicion, but a subtle sense of being prioritized, of attention sharpening, of engagement deepening. Conversations felt intentional again. The distance closed just enough to restore hope. That phase reset the baseline. It taught me what good felt like in this relationship. Then came the shift, rarely explosive, more often quiet, a change in tone, a slight withdrawal, a critical comment framed as honesty. The warmth didn't disappear, it became conditional. This was where I started adjusting without realizing it. I chose my words more carefully. I avoided certain topics. I monitored his moods. I tried to anticipate rather than react. I told myself this was maturity, emotional intelligence, consideration. But underneath it, something else was happening. I was orienting around him. The most destabilizing part of this phase wasn't the discomfort, it was the ambiguity. There was no clear explanation for the shift, no specific problem I could address and resolve. I was left guessing, interpreting, internalizing. When reasons are vague, the mind turns inward. Did I push too hard? Was I asking too much? Did I misunderstand something? He didn't need to accuse me. I was already questioning myself. Eventually, tension would build to a breaking point, an argument, a withdrawal, a rupture that felt unbearable. Not because it was catastrophic, but because it threatened the connection my body had learned to rely on. From the outside, this looked like the moment someone should leave. From the inside, it felt like the moment the relationship needed saving. And that's when the repair came. Not genuine repair, strategic repair. The version of him that felt most familiar reappeared. The attentive one, the reflective one. Sometimes there were apologies, though often vague, expressions of regret without specificity. Promises framed around intention rather than accountability. The focus wasn't on what had happened, it was on restoring closeness. Let's move past this. Let's not dwell on it. We're better than this. And because I was exhausted by the tension, that offer felt like rescue. My nervous system responded immediately. Relief, calm, a sense of safety returning. The cycle completed itself. Pain followed by relief teaches the body a powerful lesson. Endurance leads to closeness. Each repetition reinforced that learning. Over time, I noticed something unsettling. I became less concerned with whether the relationship was healthy and more concerned with managing the cycle efficiently, avoiding lows, extending highs, minimizing rupture. I wasn't asking, is this sustainable? I was asking, how do I keep things stable? That shift didn't happen because I lacked insight. It happened because the cycle had become the environment, and environments shape behavior more effectively than insight ever could. Another layer of destabilization ran quietly alongside the cycle. Inconsistency in availability, a sense never fully confirmed that I wasn't the only source of attention. A subtle feeling of competition I couldn't quite name. That uncertainty created urgency. If I didn't respond the right way, something might be lost. Urgency kept me engaged even when I was hurting. As time went on, the cycle accelerated. The good phases grew shorter, the tension phases more intense, the repairs less convincing, but more necessary. I found myself blaming myself for this escalation, believing that if I could just learn the lesson, grow enough, heal enough, the cycle would resolve. But the cycle wasn't there to teach me. It was there to regulate him. Control restored his equilibrium. Connection stabilized him. Dominance soothed him. When he felt unsettled, the cycle reset. This is why promises of change never held. He may have intended to modify his behavior in moments of repair, but intention is not capacity. Without an internal mechanism that creates sustained discomfort around harm, there was nothing to anchor change once control felt restored. So the cycle repeated and repeated. What made this cycle particularly devastating was the illusion of movement. It felt like we were going somewhere, that each rupture brought insight, that each repair deepened understanding. In reality, we were circling the same emotional terrain. The moment that began to wake me up didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with boredom, not apathy, clarity. I realized I could predict the sequence, not just broadly, but emotionally. I knew how each phase would feel in my body: the hope, the tightening, the collapse, the relief, different words, same destination. That realization was painful, but it was also liberating because it meant the problem wasn't unsolved. It was unsolvable within this structure. The cycle wasn't evidence of complexity or depth. It was evidence of permanence, of a pattern that did not soften with communication, insight, or time. Repetition became information. And once I allowed myself to see repetition as truth rather than failure, a new question emerged, one that predators never want you to ask. If this pattern continues, what will it cost me to stay? That question didn't demand an immediate answer, but once it existed, the cycle began to lose its grip. Because patterns, once seen clearly, cannot be unseen. And clarity, even quiet clarity, changes everything. The moment I stopped bending did not arrive with anger. There was no explosion, no final argument, no dramatic unveiling of truth. If anything, it arrived so quietly that I almost missed it. A small internal shift, a subtle refusal, a place inside me that simply would not contort itself one more time. For a long time, I had believed endurance was a virtue, that flexibility meant maturity. That being able to hold discomfort without breaking was proof of strength. I had built an entire identity around being the one who could adapt, absorb, and keep things going even when they were hard. And then, without warning, that ability disappeared. I noticed it first in my body, a heaviness when he spoke, a dull pressure in my chest when I anticipated seeing him. The familiar tightening that used to signal anxiety no longer surged. It settled, solid, immovable, as if my body had reached a limit and quietly closed a door. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel panic. I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The words I used to swallow now resisted being swallowed. They burned on the way down. The explanations I once offered automatically felt foreign, even dishonest. The small compromises I had framed as love suddenly felt like erasure. For the first time, I wasn't asking, why is he like this? I was asking, why am I still doing this to myself? That question marked the beginning of the end, though I didn't know it yet. This is the moment many survivors struggle to articulate because it doesn't fit the narrative people expect. There was no new revelation about him, no sudden escalation. He hadn't become worse. I had become unavailable, not emotionally cold, not detached in the way people imagine detachment. I was still feeling everything: grief, fear, confusion, longing. But something deeper had shifted. My loyalty had moved. For years, my attention had been oriented outward, toward understanding him, interpreting his moods, anticipating his needs, explaining away what didn't make sense. I had become fluent in minimizing myself to keep the relationship stable. That fluency vanished. I began noticing the cost with painful clarity. How much energy it took to stay agreeable. How often I edited myself before speaking. How my silence had become a condition for peace. How many times a day I betrayed my instincts without calling it betrayal. What broke wasn't my hope. It was my tolerance. I realized that staying required me to violate something fundamental inside myself. Not preferences, not boundaries I could negotiate, my values. I saw how often I justified behavior I would never accept if it were happening to someone I loved. How quickly I dismissed my own discomfort to preserve connection. How my strength had been turned inward against me, forcing me to manage myself instead of the environment harming me. And something inside me refused to keep participating. This refusal didn't announce itself. It didn't demand immediate action. It simply withdrew consent. I stopped explaining. I stopped over-clarifying. I stopped volunteering emotional labor to smooth over moments that should have been addressed. Not because I wanted to punish him, because I could no longer punish myself. This is the awakening people misunderstand most. From the outside, it can look like coldness or indifference. From the inside, it feels like alignment, like the psyche finally resolving a conflict it has been holding for too long. I wasn't furious. I was clear. And clarity is dangerous to predators because clarity doesn't argue, it doesn't plead, it doesn't hope, it observes. I began seeing his behaviors without the fog of interpretation. The charm that once reassured me now felt rehearsed. The apologies that once softened me now landed hollow. The familiar cycle that used to confuse me now exhausted me. Nothing about the pattern had changed. My relationship to it had. He sensed this shift before I named it. Predators always do. They are exquisitely attuned to changes in access. He responded with variations of what had worked before: tenderness, vulnerability, urgency. attempts to pull me back into the familiar emotional orbit. But those efforts landed differently now. When he provoked guilt, I felt distance. When he offered closeness, I felt wary instead of relieved. When he tried to restart old arguments, I felt bored. That boredom scared me more than anger ever had, because boredom meant the bond was loosening. This stage is often accompanied by grief, not the sharp grief of loss, but the slow grief of recognition. I grieved the woman I had been when I believed love required self abandonment. I grieved the future I had imagined. I grieved the energy I had poured into making something unworkable survive. But alongside that grief, something unexpected emerged: self respect, quiet, steady, non negotiable. For the first time in a long time, I felt loyalty to myself, not the reactive kind, not the performative kind, a grounded allegiance that didn't need justification. This didn't mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped contorting. Many survivors fear this stage because it feels unfamiliar. They worry that their emotional flatness means they've become unkind, hardened, or incapable of love. In reality, this is the nervous system exiting survival mode. It is the mind reclaiming agency. It is the self stepping back into its own body. I still felt fear. I still felt sadness. I still felt moments of longing for the familiar rhythm of the relationship. But those feelings no longer dictated my behavior. I had crossed an internal threshold from how do I make this work to why am I accepting this, from what if he changes to why should I keep waiting. That shift cannot be reversed. Once who he is becomes intolerable to who I am, the relationship becomes unsustainable. Not because it suddenly worsens, but because it is finally seen without distortion. I didn't leave immediately after this realization, but I never bent again. And that made all the difference. Because once bending stops, the end is no longer a question of if, only when and how safely. That quiet refusal was the most powerful decision I made, not because it was loud, but because it was final. For a long time, I believed leaving required one final conversation. Not a fight, not an ultimatum, a conversation. A moment where everything would be said cleanly and calmly, where truth would finally land, where harm would be acknowledged in the way it deserved to be. I imagined sitting across from him, speaking clearly, being heard without distortion. I imagined understanding arriving through explanation. What I didn't understand yet was this: closure is a luxury only safe people can offer. Predators don't give closure, they use it. Every attempt at one last conversation is an invitation back into the dynamic. Not because you are weak, but because engagement itself is the lever. As long as you are talking, explaining, processing, you are still accessible. And access is control. For a long time, I told myself I wasn't ready to leave because I still had questions. I needed answers. I needed him to admit what he had done. I needed the story to make sense. But beneath that desire was something harder to face. I wanted regulation. I wanted the pain to settle through understanding. I wanted the nervous system relief that came when conversations felt intimate, reflective, alive. I didn't realize that what I was calling closure was actually the final hit of a familiar cycle. Every time I tried to explain why something hurt, the same thing happened. The conversation shifted. He reframed, he minimized, he apologized vaguely, or defended strategically. The discussion never ended in clarity, only exhaustion. And exhaustion was the point. Predators use conversation to regain control. not to resolve harm. They keep you talking because talking keeps you engaged. Engaged people doubt themselves. Engaged people keep hoping. Engaged people stay close enough to be pulled back in. This is why the most dangerous moment is not the breakup. It is the aftermath. The bond has been threatened, control is slipping, and suddenly, you are offered exactly what you have been craving for so long: explanations, regret, self reflection, promises framed in the language you've been waiting to hear. I saw this clearly only in hindsight. The most emotionally articulate version of him appeared when I was pulling away. He spoke with nuance. He acknowledged pain in careful tones. He hinted at insight and growth. For a moment, I wavered, not because I believed him completely, but because my body recognized the pattern of relief. This is the final defense of the cycle. And this is why survivors don't need closure. They need distance. Distance breaks the trance. Distance interrupts the nervous system loop that keeps seeking relief from the same source of distress. Distance creates the conditions for clarity to arrive without being immediately undermined. Leaving a predator is not about making your point land. It is about removing your body from an environment that harms it. I didn't leave with a perfectly worded message. I didn't wait until I felt calm, confident, or resolved. I left while my hands were shaking. I left while grief still lived in my chest. I left before my mind could be pulled back into debate. I left with movement, not meaning. Running shoes, not explanations. This was one of the hardest lessons for me because I am someone who values understanding. I like coherence. I like endings that make sense. Silence felt unkind. Abruptness felt immature. I worried that refusing to explain would make me cruel. But silence is not cruelty when the relationship itself is unsafe. Silence is self-preservation. Predators interpret boundaries as challenges. They see explanations as opportunities. They hear vulnerability as leverage. Closure requires mutual reality, shared accountability, and a functioning conscience. Those conditions did not exist. Once I accepted that, something shifted. I stopped waiting for him to validate my experience. I stopped hoping for an apology that would finally tell the whole truth. I stopped needing the story to be acknowledged by the person who had distorted it. Closure, I learned, is not something a predator gives. It is something a survivor builds through distance, through time, through nervous system repair, through reconnecting with people who feel safe, through trusting my own perceptions again. Clarity came not from understanding him, but from understanding myself outside his influence. The questions changed. Instead of asking, why did he do this? I began asking, what do I need now? Instead of asking, was any of it real? I asked, what feels safe today? Those questions led forward, not back. Distance also forced me to accept something painful. Leaving might mean being misunderstood. Predators often escalate when they lose access. They rewrite history. They frame themselves as victims. They recruit others to reinforce their narrative. I wanted to explain myself to everyone, to correct the story, to defend my integrity. But safety sometimes requires letting go of being believed by people who were never truly listening. Distance taught me that peace is more important than proof. I didn't get the ending I once imagined. I didn't get validation from him. I didn't get an apology that carried weight. I didn't get acknowledgement of the harm in the way I deserved. What I got was freedom from the cycle, and that was enough. Leaving without closure didn't leave me empty. It gave me space, space to grieve, space to feel anger without being pulled back into explanation, space to remember who I was before my energy revolved around managing someone else. The silence that once frightened me became the quiet where I could hear myself again. I didn't need closure. I needed distance. Distance to break the spell. Distance to restore my nervous system. Distance to choose myself without interference. And once I stopped waiting for answers from someone who thrived on confusion, I understood something that changed everything. I was never meant to understand him. I was meant to outgrow the space where he could reach me. That was the real ending. Not dramatic, not loud, but final. And for the first time in a long time, it was mine. When I look back on this story now, what stands out is not the drama, not the moments of intensity, not even the harm itself. What stands out is how ordinary it all looked from the outside, and how quietly consuming it felt from the inside. This was never a story about chaos or obvious danger. It was a story about familiarity, about comfort, about how easily strength can be redirected inward until it becomes self-erasure. I did not enter this relationship broken. I entered it capable, conscientious, empathetic, and used to carrying weight. I believed in effort, in communication, in the idea that if something mattered, it deserved patience and care. Those beliefs did not fail me in healthy spaces. They became liabilities only in the presence of someone who operated without the internal restraints I assumed we shared. The predator did not hunt me because I was weak. He noticed me because I was strong at a moment when that strength was unguarded. He mirrored my values, matched my emotional language, and offered attention that felt like oxygen. My body learned safety before my mind learned caution. By the time clarity arrived, my nervous system was already invested in the bond. Knowing did not set me free. Patterns did. I stayed longer than I wanted to admit, not because I didn't see what was happening, but because my body had learned to associate endurance with relief. Confusion was followed by closeness. Pain was followed by repair. The cycle repeated until repetition itself became undeniable. The turning point did not come with rage or confrontation. It came when who he was became intolerable to who I was, when bending began to feel like betrayal, when silence started to feel more honest than explanation. I did not leave seeking closure. I left seeking distance, because distance was the only thing that broke the spell. This story is not about avoiding people. It is about recognizing patterns. It is about understanding that emotional fluency is not the same as emotional conscience, that attention is not intimacy, that intensity is not safety, and that consistency over time matters more than words spoken in moments of closeness. The deeper lesson here is not be more guarded. It is be more attuned. Pay attention to how your body feels around people. Notice whether closeness requires you to shrink. Watch for patterns that repeat despite conversation, insight, and effort. Understand that leaving without closure is not failure. It is self-respect. You do not need to diagnose anyone to protect yourself. You do not need certainty to honor discomfort. And you do not need to become harder to be safe. You need boundaries that protect your strengths, not punish them. Most importantly, if you recognize yourself anywhere in this story, let this be clear. Nothing about your experience means you are flawed, naive, or weak. It means you are human in a world where not everyone plays by the same internal rules. You're not broken, you're just in the middle. Before we close, here's a quick question for you. When something feels wrong in a relationship, what do you tend to trust more? A. Your logic and explanations. B. Your body and recurring patterns. Comment A or B below and tell us why you chose it. And I'd love to hear your perspective. What thoughts or reflections did this story bring up for you? Have you noticed similar patterns in your own life or in someone you care about? Share your experience in the comments so we can learn from each other. If this kind of honest, quiet storytelling resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep creating content that doesn't rush healing, doesn't shame the middle, and speaks to the truths many women carry alone.